A 12-year-old boy saved an elderly man during a flood, all by himself, without any help. The next day, a black car stopped in front of his house, and the driver delivered a message that left him speechless. The sky turned gray, and the first raindrops pounded on the worn-out rooftops. Peyton stood by the window, staring out at the street as the rain got heavier. The water already filled the potholes along the road, and the sound of distant sirens echoed through the neighborhood. He knew what this meant. Trouble was coming. "Peyton, close that window, honey," his mom Denise called out from the small kitchen, her voice tense. She was trying to keep her focus on the soup boiling on the stove, but the worry was evident. Peyton did as he was told, though his eyes lingered outside. He watched people hurrying, some holding plastic bags over their heads, some shouting to each other as the water climbed higher. His heart beat faster, remembering how quickly it could go from just rain to a full-blown flood. He grabbed an old raincoat, worn and a little too small, and slipped it on. "Where are you going?" Denise called again, seeing him heading for the door. "Just to check on the neighbors, Mom. I won't go far, I promise," Peyton replied, looking at her with that steady gaze she always found hard to argue with. She frowned, but nodded. He knew people needed help, and she knew she couldn't stop him. He stepped outside into the downpour. The rain was cold and heavy, drenching his sneakers almost immediately. He moved quickly, splashing through puddles, heading towards Mrs. Carter's place first. She was old, frail, and lived alone. He knocked hard, the sound barely audible over the roar of the rain. "Mrs. Carter, it's Peyton," he shouted. He saw the old woman peek through the window, her face etched with worry. Peyton opened the door and helped her to her feet, guiding her outside where a neighbor took over, helping her to safer ground. He nodded and moved on. The water was rising fast now, swirling down the street, carrying debris, old newspapers, cans, branches. It was chaos. As Peyton turned the corner, he spotted Mr. George. The old man was struggling in his yard, his feet already halfway submerged, trying to grab onto his mailbox to stay upright. Mr. George was kind, always greeting Peyton when he passed by, always offering a smile, and now he looked terrified. Peyton froze for just a moment. His stomach twisted. He remembered the last time water came like this. His grandpa, stuck in his house, the water coming too fast. Peyton was just a kid then, helpless. He remembered the yelling, the helplessness. He shook his head hard, forcing the memory away. This wasn't about the past. "Mr. George," Peyton shouted, running towards him. The old man tried to speak, but the words were lost in the noise of rushing water. Peyton could see Mr. George's legs slipping, his grip weakening. He hesitated for half a second. He knew how dangerous this was. The current looked stronger than before, but he couldn't let it happen again. "Hold on," Peyton yelled, pushing forward against the water. It hit him like a wall, cold, relentless. He almost lost his footing but kept moving step by painful step. The rain lashed against his face, and he squinted through it, focusing on Mr. George's terrified eyes. He reached him just as the old man's fingers slipped off the mailbox. Peyton lunged, grabbing Mr. George by the arm. It was a strong hold, but Mr. George was heavy and the current was working against them. "Peyton, leave me, boy," Mr. George gasped, coughing, water splashing over his mouth. "Save yourself." "No way, Mr. George," Peyton grunted, pulling him closer. His feet slid on the ground beneath the water, but he held on. "We're both getting out of here." He looked around, desperate for a place to go, a point of safety. He spotted a house a few feet away, the porch just barely above the rising water. It would do. He adjusted his grip under Mr. George's arms, planting his feet and pushing through the current with everything he had. It was slow. Each step felt like dragging a boulder uphill. His legs burned, his breath came in gasps, and the cold water made his muscles ache. Come on," He kept muttering to himself. He didn't let himself think about the possibility of failing, of slipping. The memory of his grandpa kept him going, driving him forward with every painful step. Finally, they reached the steps of the porch. Peyton shoved Mr. George upwards, practically lifting him onto the first step before climbing up himself. He collapsed next to Mr. George, both of them gasping, soaked through, shivering from the cold. Mr. George coughed, turning to look at Peyton. His eyes were wide, but there was gratitude there. You saved me, kid," he said, his voice shaking. Peyton nodded, trying to catch his breath. "No one's getting left behind," he said simply. The rain still poured down, and they could hear the water swirling below, rising inch by inch. They couldn't stay here forever, but at least for now, they were out of the worst of it. Peyton looked around, trying to figure out the next move. No rescue teams in sight yet. They were on their own. "Stay with me, Mr. George. We'll get through this," Peyton said, determination creeping back into his voice. He tried to push away the fear. It wasn't over, but they had a chance. "Peyton, your family," Mr. George started, but Peyton shook his head. "They'll be okay. I just need to get you somewhere safe first." Mr. George nodded, leaning back against the porch railing, his breathing starting to calm down. They had survived this far, but Peyton knew it wasn't the end of it. He had to stay sharp, had to figure out the next step. The rain wasn't letting up, and they had to find a real safe place before it was too late. For now, he just watched the water rise and tried to plan. His eyes were locked on the street, searching for any sign of help. He wasn't giving up. Not today. The rain didn't let up. Peyton and Mr. George stayed perched on the steps, both shivering, staring at the rising water. The neighborhood had turned into a murky river, the current sweeping trash and branches and whatever else it could grab. Peyton could hear distant shouts, but it was all blurred under the noise of the rain. He knew they couldn't stay on the porch much longer. The water was creeping higher, already splashing onto the top step. He needed to move Mr. George, but where? The next house over was partially submerged, and the street looked like a death trap. "Peyton," Mr. George said weakly, his voice almost lost in the storm, "you gotta save yourself, boy. I'm slowing you down." "Stop saying that," Peyton snapped. He didn't mean to sound angry, but his nerves were raw. He looked at Mr. George, his eyes locked on his. "We're getting out of here together, that's it." Mr. George just nodded, too tired to argue. Peyton scanned the area. A piece of driftwood floated past, and then something larger, a part of someone's shed maybe. Then he saw it, an old garage, barely visible through the sheets of rain. The roof was low enough that maybe, just maybe, they could climb it. "All right, Mr. George, we gotta move again," Peyton said. He stood up, his legs stiff from the cold. He pulled Mr. George to his feet, the old man groaning as his joints protested. "Where are we going, son?" Mr. George asked, his eyes following Peyton's gaze. "See that garage?" Peyton pointed. "We're gonna make it there. Gotta get to higher ground." Mr. George swallowed hard. It was clear, he was afraid. Peyton felt it too, felt it deep in his bones. But there wasn't time for that now. He slung Mr. George's arm over his shoulder and helped him down the porch steps, into the freezing water. The current hit them hard, stronger than before. It tugged at Peyton's legs, almost sweeping his feet out from under him. He tightened his grip around Mr. George, who stumbled and coughed as the water reached his waist. "Just keep moving," Peyton said, more to himself than to Mr. George. The garage wasn't far, but it felt like miles. The water pushed them back with every step, turning the short distance into a grueling battle. Peyton's breath came in ragged bursts, his legs straining to stay upright as the current clawed at them. "Peyton!" Mr. George suddenly shouted, his voice full of panic. Peyton turned just in time to see a huge branch being carried down the street, heading straight for them. He ducked, pulling Mr. George with him, and felt the rush of air as the branch whipped past, barely missing them. "Keep your head down," Peyton said, his heart pounding. They pressed on. Peyton could feel his legs starting to give, the cold biting into his muscles. Each step took everything he had. But the garage was closer now. Almost there. He could see the old, rusted drain pipe running up the side of it. If they could just make it to that. Finally, they reached the side of the garage. Peyton leaned against the wall, his entire body trembling from exhaustion. Mr. George collapsed beside him, gasping for air. "We did it. We made it." Mr. George panted, his eyes wide. Peyton didn't answer. He was already looking up, assessing the drain pipe. It didn't look sturdy, but it was all they had. The water was still rising, lapping at their waists now. They couldn't stay here. "All right, Mr. George, I'm gonna help you climb," Peyton said, his voice steady. He had to stay calm, for both of them. He grabbed the drain pipe, giving it a hard tug. It wobbled, but held. It would have to do. "Just hold on to me, okay?" Peyton said, positioning himself beneath Mr. George. The old man nodded, his hands shaking as he reached for the pipe. It was slow going. Mr. George's legs weren't strong, and the cold had sapped what little energy he had left. Peyton pushed from below, guiding his feet onto small footholds, inch by inch. The pipe groaned under their weight, and for a moment, Peyton thought it might snap. He held his breath, his muscles burning, until Mr. George finally made it to the top, collapsing onto the flat roof. "All right, my turn," Peyton muttered to himself. He grabbed the pipe, climbing quickly, his hands numb against the cold metal. He swung his leg over the edge and dropped onto the roof next to Mr. George, both of them panting, soaked to the bone. They lay there for a moment, just catching their breath. The rain beat down, relentless. Peyton stared up at the sky, water splattering his face, trying to steady his breathing. They were safe, for now. "Thank you, Peyton," Mr. George said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. I don't know how to repay you, boy." Peyton shook his head. "Don't need to repay me. Just gotta stay alive, Mr. George." Mr. George smiled weakly, nodding. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of rain filling the empty spaces between them. Peyton kept his eyes on the water below, watching it rise, watching for anything that might come their way. He heard a noise then, a deep, low creak. Peyton's head snapped around, eyes widening. The garage below them was old, and it wasn't built to handle this kind of strain. He could feel the roof shift slightly beneath him, a shiver running up his spine. "Mr. George, we can't stay here. This thing's not gonna hold much longer," Peyton said, his voice urgent. Where do we go?" Mr. George asked, his face pale. Peyton scanned the area again, his eyes narrowing against the rain. There was another house, farther down the street, but it looked stable. The roof wasn't too high. Maybe they could make it. He pointed. "There, we gotta make it over there." Mr. George followed his gaze, his face grim. "You sure, Peyton?" "Don't have a choice," Peyton replied. He pulled Mr. George to his feet again, and they made their way across the roof, carefully. The garage creaked ominously beneath them, but they moved as quickly as they could. They reached the edge. The gap between the garage and the house looked bigger now, with the water swirling below like a hungry beast. Peyton clenched his jaw, trying not to think about what would happen if they missed. "I'll go first. I'll help you across," Peyton said, his voice firm. He took a deep breath, then jumped, landing hard on the house roof. He turned back, holding his hand out. "Come on, Mr. George. You can do this." The old man hesitated, fear in his eyes, but he trusted Peyton. He reached out, grabbing Peyton's hand, and with a grunt, he jumped. Peyton pulled him across, both of them collapsing on the roof. They were safe. For now. Peyton sat up, looking around, his body aching from the effort. They needed real help, and soon. He had pushed himself further than he thought he could, and Mr. George was barely holding on. Peyton turned his gaze towards the dark sky, hoping, praying to see lights, to hear the sound of a helicopter or anything that meant help was on the way. He couldn't do this alone for much longer. "Peyton," Mr. George said softly, his eyes half closed. "You're a good boy. You know that." Peyton looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "I just want us to get out of here, Mr. George." "And we will," Mr. George whispered, his voice weak. "You'll see." Peyton nodded, but he didn't say anything. He kept his eyes on the horizon, waiting for something, anything, that could bring them out of this nightmare. The rain kept falling, but he wasn't giving up. Not yet. The night came slowly, and with it, a deep, biting cold. The rain kept pouring, and Peyton and Mr. George lay on the roof, soaked to the bone. They were both exhausted, their bodies stiff from the cold and the struggle against the rising water. The sky was pitch black, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, illuminating the flooded street below for a brief second, before fading back into darkness. Peyton shivered, pulling his knees to his chest. He had to stay awake. He had to keep watch, had to be ready in case the water rose higher or something else came their way. He glanced at Mr. George, who was lying flat on his back, his chest rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. "You okay, Mr. George?" Peyton asked, his voice hoarse. Mr. George turned his head, his eyes half open. "I'm all right, Peyton. Just tired. Real tired." Peyton nodded. He knew the feeling. He was exhausted too, every muscle in his body aching from the strain. But he couldn't rest. Not yet. He had to keep Mr. George safe. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the rain the only thing breaking the quiet. Peyton's eyes kept darting around, searching for any sign of help, lights, sirens, anything. But there was nothing. Just darkness and water. "Peyton," Mr. George said suddenly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I ever tell you about my son?" Peyton looked over at him, frowning. "No, sir. I don't think you did." Mr. George let out a long sigh, his eyes staring up at the dark sky. "He's grown now. Lives up north. Haven't seen him in years." Peyton didn't say anything. He just listened. "We had a falling out. Stupid thing. Don't even remember what it was about, really," Mr. George continued, his voice distant. "I always meant to call him. Just never got around to it." Peyton swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't imagine not seeing his family for years. Even when things were tough, they were always there for each other. "You think he'd be proud of you," Mr. George said, his eyes shifting to look at Peyton. "What you did today. That took guts." Peyton shook his head. I couldn't let anything happen to you. I lost my grandpa like this. I couldn't. Not again." Mr. George was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "I get it, kid. I really do." Another flash of lightning lit up the sky, and Peyton saw the water below, still swirling, still rising. He clenched his jaw, his body tensing. They had to hold on a little longer. Someone had to come. They couldn't be the only ones left out here. "Peyton, you need to rest," Mr. George said, his voice weak. "You've done more than enough. You gotta take care of yourself too." "I can't," Peyton replied, shaking his head. "I gotta watch. What if the water comes up here?" Mr. George reached out, putting a hand on Peyton's arm. His grip was weak, but his eyes were steady. "You can't take care of me if you're too tired to move, son." Peyton looked at him, his eyes stinging. He knew Mr. George was right, but the thought of closing his eyes, of letting his guard down, made his heart pound. He was scared of what might happen if he wasn't paying attention. "Just for a bit," Mr. George said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "Just rest your eyes for a minute. I'll keep watch." Peyton hesitated, then nodded slowly. He lay back on the roof, his body sinking into the cold, wet surface. His eyes felt heavy, and he let them close, just for a moment. He could hear the rain, the water, Mr. George's slow, steady breathing. It was almost comforting. "Thank you, Peyton," Mr. George said, his voice barely audible. Peyton wanted to respond, but he was already drifting, his mind slipping into the darkness of sleep. He didn't dream. He was too tired for dreams. He wasn't sure how long he slept. Minutes, maybe an hour. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, his eyes snapping open. The rain was still falling, but something had changed. The wind had picked up, and the roof beneath him was trembling, the old wood creaking under the strain. "Mr. George," Peyton said, sitting up quickly, his eyes scanning the dark. "I'm here, Peyton," Mr. George replied, his voice shaky. He was sitting up too, his eyes wide. "The roof. It's not gonna hold much longer." Peyton felt his stomach twist. The water was higher now, almost reaching the edge of the roof. They had to move, had to find somewhere safer. But where? "We gotta go," Peyton said, his voice trembling. He stood up, pulling Mr. George to his feet. "Come on, we'll find something." Mr. George nodded, leaning heavily on Peyton as they moved towards the edge of the roof. Peyton looked around, his eyes straining to see through the rain. There was another house, a little farther down, higher ground maybe. It was their only shot. "All right, we're gonna jump. I'll go first, then I'll help you," Peyton said, his voice firm, though his hands were shaking. He took a deep breath, then jumped, landing hard on the next roof. He turned back, holding out his hand. "Come on, Mr. George, you can do it." Mr. George hesitated, fear in his eyes. But he trusted Peyton. He reached out, grabbing Peyton's hand, and with a grunt, he jumped. Peyton pulled him across, both of them collapsing onto the roof. They lay there for a moment, catching their breath. The rain beat down, relentless, the wind howling around them. Peyton looked at Mr. George, his heart pounding in his chest. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Mr. George nodded, his eyes closed. "I'm okay, Peyton. Thanks to you." Peyton turned his head, looking out at the dark, flooded street. The water was everywhere, and there was still no sign of help. He felt a knot of fear in his chest, but he pushed it down. They had made it this far. They just had to hold on a little longer. "Peyton," Mr. George said, his voice soft. "You're a good kid. You know that." Peyton looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "I just want us to get out of here, Mr. George." Mr. George smiled, his eyes tired but full of warmth. "And we will, Peyton. We will." Peyton nodded, but he didn't say anything. He kept his eyes on the horizon, waiting for something, anything, that could bring them out of this nightmare. The night stretched on, cold and dark, but he wasn't giving up. Not yet. The sky began to lighten, but the rain didn't stop. Peyton's eyes were sore, his muscles stiff from the long night. He blinked, trying to adjust to the pale gray light that was slowly breaking through the darkness. Mr. George was next to him, leaning against the chimney stack on the roof, his eyes half closed but still awake. Peyton looked around. The water below was higher than before, almost covering the tops of the street signs. The neighborhood was completely unrecognizable, a gray, shifting sea with nothing but rooftops and broken debris poking out. "We made it through the night, Mr. George," Peyton said, nudging the old man lightly on the shoulder. Mr. George opened his eyes, blinking up at Peyton. "Barely," he said with a weak smile. His voice was raspy, and he looked pale, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "But I knew we would. You're tougher than you look, kid." Peyton just nodded, his face set with determination. He had to focus. They were still in trouble, and the light of day didn't mean they were out of danger. He needed a plan. He looked out over the flooded landscape, hoping to see something, anything, that would help them get to safety. And then he heard it. A sound that made his heart skip. A distant, rhythmic thumping getting louder. He turned his head, eyes scanning the sky. There, between the clouds, a speck of light was moving, growing larger. The unmistakable sound of helicopter blades slicing through the air filled his ears. "Mr. George, look," Peyton shouted, pointing upwards. Mr. George squinted, his face lighting up with hope. "A helicopter," he whispered, his eyes widening. Peyton stood up, waving his arms, shouting as loud as he could, "Hey, over here, we need help." The helicopter hovered above the flooded street, its spotlight sweeping back and forth. Peyton kept waving, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline kicking in, pushing back the exhaustion and the cold. This was it. This was their chance. Come on," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the helicopter. The spotlight swept closer, moving over the water, until finally, it stopped on them, the bright beam blinding for a moment. "They see us," Peyton yelled, turning to Mr. George, who managed a weak smile. "We're gonna be okay." The helicopter hovered lower, and Peyton could see the rescuer leaning out, giving a thumbs up. Peyton returned the gesture, relief washing over him like a wave. He turned to Mr. George, crouching down beside him. "All right, Mr. George, we're getting off this roof. You ready?" Peyton said, his voice trembling with both excitement and exhaustion. Mr. George nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm ready, Peyton. Thanks to you." The rescuer dropped a harness down, and Peyton caught it, quickly securing it around Mr. George. He tugged on the line, signaling they were ready. Slowly, Mr. George was lifted off the roof, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief as he was hoisted into the air. Peyton watched, his heart pounding, until Mr. George was safely inside the helicopter. The rescuer gave him another thumbs up, then dropped the harness back down. Peyton grabbed it, securing it around himself, and within moments, he felt himself being lifted off the roof. The wind from the helicopter blades whipped around him, the water below spinning in a dizzying blur. Peyton closed his eyes, holding on tight as he was lifted higher and higher. He felt the strong hands of the rescuer pulling him into the helicopter, and suddenly he was inside, the noise deafening, but the sense of safety overwhelming. Mr. George was lying on a stretcher, his eyes closed, but he was breathing. Peyton leaned back, closing his own eyes for a moment, the tension finally starting to leave his body. "We got you, kid," one of the rescuers said, patting him on the shoulder. "You did good." Peyton just nodded, too tired to speak. He looked out the window, watching the flooded neighborhood fade away beneath them. They were safe now, but he knew it wasn't over. Not for his family. He needed to find them, to make sure they were okay. The helicopter took them to an emergency shelter, set up in a school gymnasium that had managed to stay dry. The gym was crowded, filled with families who had been rescued from their homes. Peyton's eyes scanned the faces, looking for his mom, for Mia. His heart raced with every step as he walked through the crowded room. "Mom! Mia!" he called out, his voice cracking. He pushed past groups of people, his eyes darting from face to face. He felt panic rising again, the fear that something had happened to them, that they hadn't made it. Then he heard it. "Peyton!" He turned, his eyes widening as he saw his mom running towards him, Mia in her arms. Peyton felt his legs give out, the exhaustion of the past day finally catching up with him. Denise wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God, Peyton," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I was so worried about you." Peyton hugged her back, burying his face in her shoulder. He felt Mia's small hand on his back, and he pulled away slightly, looking at his little sister. She was crying too, her face streaked with dirt, but alive. Safe. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm okay," Peyton said, his voice trembling. He looked over at Mia, giving her a tired smile. "Hey you. You keeping Mom out of trouble?" Mia nodded, her eyes wide. "I was really scared, Peyton. I thought you weren't gonna come back." Peyton shook his head, pulling her into a hug. "I promised I'd always come back, didn't I?" Mia nodded, clinging to him, and Peyton closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of his family around him. He was tired, so tired, but they were all together. That was all that mattered. Denise pulled back, looking at him, her eyes filled with both tears and pride. "I heard what you did, Peyton. People are talking about you. About how you saved Mr. George." Peyton shrugged, glancing away. I couldn't let anything happen to him, Mom. He needed me." Denise smiled, cupping his face in her hands. "You're so brave, Peyton. You know that. You're the bravest kid I know." Peyton felt his face flush, and he looked down, embarrassed. He wasn't sure about being brave. He just knew he had to do what he could, because no one else would. "Come on, let's get you something to eat," Denise said, her voice gentle. She led him over to where they had set up tables with food, and Peyton sank into a chair, his entire body aching. Mia sat next to him, her small hand never leaving his arm, as if she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. He ate slowly, the warmth of the soup spreading through his body, easing the cold that had settled in his bones. He could hear people talking, murmuring about the flood, about the people they'd lost, the homes that were gone. It wasn't over yet. There was still so much to face. But at least they were together. At least they had each other. Mr. George was resting in another part of the gym, surrounded by paramedics. Peyton watched from afar, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. They'd both made it, and Mr. George would be all right. The morning sun was starting to break through the clouds, casting a pale light across the gym. It wasn't much, but it was something. Peyton leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for just a moment. They had made it through the night, and now, maybe, just maybe, they could start to find their way forward. The morning sunlight streamed through the broken windows of the gymnasium, cutting across the faces of the gathered families. The storm had finally begun to let up, but the chaos it left behind was far from over. Peyton could still hear the hum of voices, the cries of babies, and the hollow sounds of people just trying to get by. Peyton leaned against the wall, watching as people moved around the room, collecting supplies, hugging loved ones. His mom, Denise, had gone to speak to one of the volunteers, trying to figure out what their next steps were. Mia was resting, her head leaning against Peyton's side, her tiny fingers wrapped around his arm. "Hey, Peyton," Denise called as she walked back toward them, a small plastic bag in her hand. "They're giving out clothes and toiletries. I got a couple things for us." She sat down next to Peyton, opening the bag to show him. There were a few t-shirts, a toothbrush, and some soap. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thanks, Mom," Peyton said, his voice tired. He glanced at Mia, who was still asleep, her face finally relaxed. "We're gonna be okay," Denise said quietly, her voice trembling just a little. "It's gonna be tough, but we'll get through this." Peyton nodded, but he didn't say anything. He wanted to believe her, but he knew how hard it was going to be. Their house was partially destroyed, most of their things gone, but at least they were all alive. That had to count for something. He looked across the gym and spotted Mr. George lying on a cot, his eyes closed. Peyton stood up carefully, making sure not to wake Mia. He walked over to Mr. George's cot and knelt down beside him. Mr. George opened his eyes, a smile spreading across his face when he saw Peyton. "Peyton," Mr. George said, his voice hoarse but full of warmth. "You all right, kid?" "Yeah," Peyton said, nodding. "I'm all right. How about you?" "I've been better," Mr. George said, chuckling softly. "But thanks to you, I'm here. I owe you my life, Peyton." Peyton looked down, shrugging. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. George. I couldn't let anything happen to you." Mr. George reached out, placing a hand on Peyton's shoulder. His grip was weak, but Peyton could feel the gratitude in it. "You did good, kid. Your grandpa would be proud of you." Peyton swallowed, his throat tight. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Mr. George gave his shoulder a light squeeze, then let his hand fall back to his side. "Now, you go take care of your family," Mr. George said. "They need you." "Yeah," Peyton said, standing up. "I will. You take care, Mr. George." Mr. George smiled, his eyes closing again. Peyton watched him for a moment, then turned and walked back to where his mom and Mia were sitting. Denise looked up at him, her eyes soft. "How's Mr. George?" she asked. "He's gonna be okay," Peyton said, sitting down next to her. He looked at Mia, still sleeping, her small body curled up against the wall. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. Denise sighed, looking around the crowded gym. "I talked to one of the volunteers. They said we can stay here for a little while, but we're gonna have to figure something out soon. They're trying to find places for people to go, but it's all so uncertain." Peyton nodded. He knew it was going to be hard. He could see it in his mom's eyes, the worry, the exhaustion. But he also saw something else, determination. She wasn't giving up, and neither was he. "We'll figure it out, Mom," Peyton said, his voice steady. "We always do." Denise smiled, her eyes glistening. She reached over, pulling Peyton into a hug. He let himself relax for a moment, leaning into her, feeling the warmth of her embrace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was hope. Later that day, as the sun climbed higher, people started to venture out of the gym to see what was left of their neighborhood. Peyton, Denise, and Mia joined them, stepping outside into the wet, muddy mess that used to be their street. The water had receded, leaving behind a thick layer of mud and debris. Broken branches, pieces of furniture, shattered glass. Everything was scattered across the road. Peyton's heart sank as they walked down the street, towards where their house used to be. It was still standing, but barely. The windows were shattered, the front door hanging off its hinges. The entire first floor was flooded, the water line visible halfway up the walls. Denise stood in front of the house, her eyes wide, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mia clung to Peyton's side, her eyes wide with fear. "Is our house broken, Peyton?" she asked, the voice small. Peyton nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, Mia, it's pretty broken, but we're gonna fix it, okay? We're gonna make it better." Denise turned to look at Peyton, her eyes filled with tears. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "We're gonna fix it," she said, her voice steady. "We're not giving up." They stepped inside, the floor squelching beneath their feet. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, mud covering everything. Peyton looked around, his heart heavy. It was hard to believe this was their home. But it was still here, and that was something. They spent the next few hours trying to salvage what they could. Peyton and Denise worked together, lifting furniture, sorting through the wreckage. Mia stayed close, her eyes wide as she watched them work. It was slow, exhausting work, but Peyton didn't stop. He couldn't. They had to do this. They had to rebuild. As the sun started to set, They finally stopped, their bodies aching from the effort. They sat down on the front steps, looking out at the street. It was still a mess, but people were working, neighbors helping each other, families carrying what they could back to their homes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Denise looked at Peyton, her eyes tired but full of determination. "We're gonna get through this," she said, her voice steady. "We're gonna rebuild." Peyton nodded, his eyes scanning the street. He saw Mr. George a few houses down, sitting on his porch waving at them. Peyton waved back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, Mom," he said, his voice soft. "We're gonna get through this." They sat there together, watching the sun sink below the horizon, the sky turning a deep shade of orange. It was the end of a long, terrible day. But it was also the beginning of something new. A chance to rebuild, to start over. And Peyton knew, as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. The morning came with a dull glow, and the air smelled of mud and damp wood. Peyton woke up on the makeshift bed they'd set up in what used to be their living room. It was far from comfortable, just a few blankets and a tarp laid across the wet, muddy floor. But it was home. He blinked, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the work they had done yesterday. His mom was already up, her footsteps light as she moved around the house, trying to make sense of what could be saved. "Mornin', Peyton," Denise called softly, seeing him stir. She was by the window peering out, trying to make some sort of plan for the day. "You should eat something." Peyton pushed himself up, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, okay," he muttered, stretching his sore arms. He grabbed a piece of bread from the small stash they had managed to keep dry. It was stale, but it was food. Mia was still asleep, curled up in a ball under a blanket. Peyton smiled as he watched her, her small face peaceful despite everything. He wished he could shield her from all of this, to make it so she wouldn't have to see their home in ruins. But for now, all he could do was be there for her. "Peyton, come outside for a bit," Denise called from the front door. "I want to talk about what we can do today." He nodded, standing up and stepping outside. The morning air was still cool, and the streets were quiet, except for the sounds of people rummaging through the remains of their homes. He saw Mrs. Carter, the elderly lady from down the street, struggling to carry a bundle of clothes across her yard. "Hold on, Mom," Peyton said, walking down the porch steps towards Mrs. Carter. He trotted over to her, taking the bundle from her arms. "Let me help you, Mrs. Carter." She looked up at him, her eyes tired but grateful. "Oh, Peyton, thank you. I was trying to get these clothes hung up to dry." Peyton nodded, following her to the clothesline in her backyard. He worked quickly, hanging the clothes up, feeling the damp fabric cling to his fingers. Mrs. Carter watched him, a small smile on her face. "You're a good boy, Peyton, always helping out," she said softly. He shrugged, trying not to think too much about it. "Just doing what I can, Mrs. Carter. We're all in this together, right?" She nodded, her smile growing. "Yes, dear, we are." After helping Mrs. Carter, Peyton returned to his mom, who was waiting for him in front of their house. She had her arms crossed, her gaze on the waterlogged neighborhood. "Thanks for helping her," Denise said, giving him a small nod. "But we've got to figure out our own situation too, Peyton. We can't stay in this house like this forever." Peyton frowned, looking up at the roof, where part of it had caved in from the weight of the water. "I know, Mom. But where else are we gonna go?" Denise sighed, glancing down the street. "I don't know. I heard some folks talking about temporary shelters being set up on the other side of town. But they're crowded, and they won't take us for long." Peyton nodded. It was hard to know what the best move was. The shelter sounded like an option, but he knew how those places could be, full of people, no privacy, no guarantee of anything. Staying at the house wasn't much better, but at least it was theirs. As they talked, the rumble of a car engine echoed down the street. Peyton turned, his eyes widening at the sight of the black car slowly rolling towards them. It was pristine, standing out against the mud-streaked road, and it came to a stop right in front of their house. Peyton felt his heart skip. He exchanged a glance with his mom, her expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, well-dressed, wearing a dark suit that looked far too clean for a place like this. He glanced around, his eyes taking in the damaged houses, the people, the destruction. "Is this Peyton's house?" the man asked, his voice calm, almost soft. Denise stepped forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, a polite gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. "My name is Richard. I'm Mr. George's son. I heard about what happened, about what your boy did for my father." Peyton blinked, surprised. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I'm Peyton." Richard looked at him, his expression shifting slightly. "You must be the one who saved my father's life," he said, his voice carrying a note of sincerity that caught Peyton off guard. "He hasn't stopped talking about you, you know." Peyton shifted his weight, glancing at his mom. "I just did what I had to do. I couldn't leave him there." Richard nodded, his eyes studying Peyton for a moment. "That's what he said. He said you showed incredible courage." He paused, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small envelope. "Listen, I wanted to come by and thank you personally. And my family and we wanted to help you, in whatever way we could." He handed the envelope to Peyton, who took it hesitantly. It was thick, the paper crisp beneath his fingers. He opened it, his eyes widening at the sight of the bills inside. It was money, more money than Peyton had ever seen in one place. He looked up at Richard, his heart pounding. I can't take this," Peyton stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Denise stepped closer, her eyes widening as she glanced at the envelope. This is a lot," she said, her voice trembling. Richard nodded. "I know. But please take it. You saved my father's life. It's the least we can do." He looked at Peyton, his expression softening. "Use it to fix your house, to take care of your family. You deserve it." Peyton looked at his mom, her eyes shining with tears. He could see the hesitation, the fear of accepting something like this, of owing someone something. But he could also see the hope, the idea that maybe, just maybe, this could make things a little easier. "Mom," Peyton said, his voice uncertain. Denise took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Richard's. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you so much." Richard smiled, nodding. "You're welcome. And if you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask. My father thinks the world of you, Peyton. You're a good kid." Peyton swallowed, nodding. "Thank you, sir." Richard turned, walking back to his car. He paused, looking back at Peyton one last time. "Take care of yourself, Peyton. And your family." Peyton watched as Richard got into the car and drove away, the black vehicle disappearing down the street. He looked down at the envelope, his heart pounding in his chest. This was real. This was help. Something they hadn't had in a long time. Denise reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were filled with a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, fear. "This could change everything, Peyton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Peyton nodded, his eyes still on the money. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe it will." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the envelope heavy in Peyton's hand. It wasn't a solution to all their problems, but it was a start. It was a chance to rebuild, to make things better. Denise turned, her eyes glistening. "Let's go tell Mia," she said, her voice trembling. "She's gonna be so happy." Peyton nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. They walked back to the house together, the hope of a new beginning finally starting to take root. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. With the money Richard had given them, Peyton, Denise, and Mia started to make real changes to their house. It wasn't easy work, and it wasn't quick, but for the first time since the storm, they had the resources to make things happen, and that alone was enough to give them hope. Peyton spent his days in old clothes, covered in mud and sawdust, as they patched the holes in the walls, tore out the soaked drywall, and scrubbed away the dirt and grime. It was hard work, and the ache in his muscles was constant, but he didn't mind. Not when he saw the progress they were making. "Hey, Peyton," Denise called from the other side of the room. She was balancing on a stepladder, trying to get a piece of plywood up to cover a broken window. "Give me a hand, will you?" "Yeah, I'm coming, Mom." Peyton hurried over, grabbing the edge of the plywood and holding it steady as Denise hammered it in place. The rhythmic thud of the hammer was almost comforting, a reminder that things were moving forward. They worked together, side by side, pausing only to share a smile or a brief moment of laughter. Even Mia got involved, doing her best to help by cleaning up bits of wood and dust or holding a flashlight when it got dark. She was small, but she was determined, her eyes bright with excitement as she watched their home slowly take shape again. One afternoon, as they were hauling out broken furniture to the curb, Peyton noticed some of the neighbors gathering down the street. They were carrying pieces of wood, old tools, some even had buckets of paint. He watched as they moved toward Mrs. Carter's house, and he realized they were all there to help her. "Looks like everyone's pitching in," Denise said, stepping beside Peyton and wiping the sweat from her forehead. She nodded towards the group of neighbors. "Maybe we should go help too." Peyton glanced at his mom, a smile forming on his face. "Yeah, I think we should." He dropped the piece of furniture he was holding, giving Mia a quick nod. "Come on, Mia, let's go help Mrs. Carter." Mia beamed, her little face lighting up as she grabbed Peyton's hand. Together they walked down the street, joining the group of neighbors who were already hard at work. Peyton took a deep breath, rolling up his sleeves. "All right, what do you need me to do?" he asked. Mr. Jenkins, the man who lived a few houses down, looked up, his face streaked with sweat. "Peyton, good to see you, kid. We could use a hand getting some of this old furniture out of here." Peyton nodded, glancing at Mia. "You stay with Mom, okay?" he said, his voice gentle. Mia nodded, her eyes wide with excitement as she watched everyone working together. Denise smiled, pulling Mia closer as Peyton walked over to help Mr. Jenkins. They worked for hours, the sun beating down on them as they carried out broken furniture, hauled in wood, and helped patch up the old walls. It was exhausting work, but there was something different about it this time. It wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about the people, about coming together, about helping each other find a way forward. "Hey, Peyton," someone called from behind him. He turned to see Mrs. Carter, her face tired but full of gratitude. She held out a small plate, a couple of sandwiches piled on top. "You look like you could use a break, young man." Peyton wiped the sweat from his forehead, smiling. "Thanks, Mrs. Carter. I could definitely use that." He took a sandwich, biting into it, the taste of peanut butter and jelly making him realize just how hungry he was. Mrs. Carter smiled, patting his shoulder. "You've been a godsend, Peyton. I don't know what I'd do without all of you kids helping out." Peyton shrugged, swallowing the bite of his sandwich. "We're all in this together, Mrs. Carter. It's what neighbors are for, right?" She nodded, her eyes softening. "Right." As the afternoon turned into evening, they finally stopped, the work done for the day. Mrs. Carter's house still needed a lot of work, but they'd managed to make it livable again. Peyton looked around, seeing the tired but satisfied smiles on everyone's faces, the sense of accomplishment in the air. "All right, folks," Mr. Jenkins called out, clapping his hands. "Let's call it a day. We've done good work here." There was a murmur of agreement, and people started to gather their things, getting ready to head home. Peyton felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of community, of hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. "Peyton," Denise called, walking over with Mia. She had a tired but proud smile on her face. "Ready to head home?" Peyton nodded, looking down at Mia, who was clutching a small stuffed animal she'd found in the debris. A little bear, its fur matted but still intact. She looked up at Peyton, her eyes bright. "Look, Peyton. I found him, and I'm gonna clean him up and take care of him," she said, a voice full of excitement. Peyton smiled, ruffling her hair. "That's a great idea, Mia. He's lucky to have you." Mia beamed, hugging the stuffed bear to her chest as they walked back down the street towards their house. Denise glanced at Peyton, her eyes soft. "You did good today, Peyton. Helping Mrs. Carter like that. You're turning into a real leader around here." Peyton shrugged, glancing away. "I just did what anyone else would do. We all need to help each other, right?" Denise nodded, a proud smile on her face. "That's right. But not everyone steps up the way you do, Peyton. You've got a good heart." Peyton felt his cheeks flush, and he looked down, not knowing how to respond. He wasn't doing it for praise. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do, because it was what his grandpa would have done, because it was what Mr. George needed, what Mrs. Carter needed, what his family needed. That night, as they sat in the house, surrounded by the sound of hammering and sawing from the work still going on in the neighborhood, Peyton felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, they had a long way to go. But they were making it work. They were rebuilding, not just their house, but their community. "Peyton." Mia's voice was soft, her eyes already drooping as she lay on the small mattress they'd made up for her. "Yeah, Mia," Peyton replied, his voice gentle. "Are we gonna be okay?" she asked, her voice small, her eyes filled with the kind of fear only a child could have. Peyton moved closer, kneeling beside her, brushing her hair away from her face. "Yeah, Mia, we're gonna be okay," he said, his voice steady. "We've got each other, and as long as we have that, we'll be just fine." Mia nodded, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep. Denise watched from the other side of the room, her heart swelling with both pride and gratitude. Peyton looked at his mom, giving her a small smile. They had lost so much, but they still had each other. And that was enough to keep going. The night was quiet, the sounds of the neighborhood settling into a calm rhythm. Peyton lay down, closing his eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day pull him into sleep. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, he felt like they were going to make it. One day at a time. A few weeks had passed since the flood, and the neighborhood had begun to show signs of recovery. The streets were still cluttered with debris, and many houses bore the scars of the storm. But there was a sense of life returning. People were getting back on their feet, finding ways to rebuild what had been lost. The mood had shifted from despair to determination. Peyton felt that change deep in his bones. He was part of it. "Peyton," Denise called from the kitchen. "Why don't you take a break? You've been at it all morning." Peyton wiped the sweat from his forehead, putting down the hammer he'd been using. "Yeah, all right, Mom." He glanced at Mia, who was sitting in the corner, drawing on a scrap piece of paper. "Mia, you want to come for a walk?" Mia looked up, her eyes lighting up. "Where are we going?" "I'm gonna go check on Mr. George. You want to come say hi?" Mia nodded enthusiastically, hopping up and grabbing her stuffed bear. She hurried over to Peyton, her eyes bright. "Let's go." Denise smiled, giving them a nod. "Tell Mr. George I said hello, okay?" "Will do, Mom." Peyton took Mia's hand, leading her out the front door. The sun was shining, and a light breeze blew through the neighborhood, carrying with it the smell of freshly cut wood and damp earth. They made their way down the street, passing by neighbors who waved and smiled at them. Peyton waved back, feeling a sense of connection to everyone around him. It was strange. Before the flood, he hadn't known most of these people very well. They'd just been neighbors, people who lived nearby. But now, after everything they'd been through, they were something more. They were a community. They reached Mr. George's house, and Peyton knocked on the door, the old wood rattling under his fist. There was a moment of silence. Then the door creaked open, and Mr. George's face appeared, his eyes lighting up at the sight of Peyton and Mia. "Well, if it isn't my two favorite visitors," Mr. George said, his voice full of warmth. He opened the door wider, gesturing for them to come inside. Come in. I was just making some lemonade." "Hi, Mr. George," Mia said, her voice excited. She held up her stuffed bear. "I brought my bear. I wanted to show you. He's all cleaned up now." Mr. George smiled, crouching down to look at the bear. "Well, isn't he handsome? You did a fine job, Mia." Mia beamed, hugging the bear tightly. Peyton smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Mr. George straightened up, looking at Peyton, his eyes soft. "How have you been, Peyton?" Mr. George asked, his voice gentle. "Been working hard, I bet." Peyton nodded. "Yeah, we've been fixing up the house. It's getting there, slowly but surely." Mr. George patted Peyton on the shoulder. "I'm proud of you, kid. You've been a real leader around here, you know that." Peyton looked down, feeling his cheeks flush. "I'm just doing what I can." Mr. George smiled, nodding. "That's all any of us can do." He turned, gesturing towards the kitchen. "Why don't you two come sit down? I'll get that lemonade." Peyton and Mia followed Mr. George into the kitchen, sitting down at the small table. The house was still a bit of a mess, but it was clear that Mr. George had been working to put things back together. The walls were patched up, and the furniture had been rearranged. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. Mr. George poured 3 glasses of lemonade, setting them down on the table. Mia took a big sip, her eyes widening. This is really good, Mr. George." Mr. George chuckled, sitting down across from them. "I'm glad you like it, Mia." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their lemonade. Peyton looked around the room, his eyes landing on an old photo sitting on the counter. It was a picture of a younger Mr. George, standing with a boy who looked to be about Peyton's age. "Is that your son?" Peyton asked, nodding towards the photo. Mr. George followed Peyton's gaze, his expression softening. He nodded, a wistful smile on his face. "Yeah, that's my boy, Richard. Haven't seen him in years, but he was here after the flood. You met him, didn't you?" Peyton nodded. "Yeah, I did. He's a good man." Mr. George's smile grew, his eyes glistening. "He is. We've had our differences, but after everything that happened, I think we're starting to find our way back to each other. Sometimes it takes something big to remind you of what really matters, you know?" Peyton nodded, his throat tight. He understood that better than he could say. The flood had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something, a chance to reconnect, to rebuild not just their homes, but their relationships. "Richard said he's coming back down in a few weeks," Mr. George continued, his voice soft. "Wants to help me fix up the rest of the house. I think we're finally gonna be all right." "That's great, Mr. George," Peyton said, his voice sincere. He took a deep breath, setting his glass down. "You know my grandpa. He was a lot like you, strong, always willing to help people." Mr. George looked at Peyton, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your grandpa. He was a good man, wasn't he?" Peyton nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah, he was. I wish I could have done more for him, you know." Mr. George reached across the table, placing a hand on Peyton's arm. His grip was firm, his eyes steady. "You were just a kid, Peyton. You did everything you could. And look at you now. You're out here saving people, helping your neighbors. Your grandpa would be proud of you. I know I am." Peyton felt his eyes sting, and he looked down, blinking back the tears. "Thanks, Mr. George." Mr. George nodded, giving Peyton's arm a light squeeze before letting go. "You're a good kid, Peyton. You've got a big heart, and that's what this world needs more of." They sat there for a while longer, talking and laughing, the weight of the past few weeks slowly lifting. Mia showed Mr. George her drawings, and he listened with genuine interest, his eyes twinkling as he asked her questions about each one. Eventually the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow through the windows. Peyton stood up, giving Mr. George a nod. "We should probably get going. Mom's gonna be wondering where we are." Mr. George stood as well, walking them to the door. "You two take care, all right? And come back and visit an old man sometime." "We will," Peyton promised. He took Mia's hand, giving Mr. George one last smile. "Thanks for the lemonade." Mr. George waved them off, watching as they walked down the steps and back onto the street. As they walked home, Peyton looked down at Mia, her small hand gripping his tightly. "You okay, Peyton?" Mia asked, her voice soft. Peyton looked at her smiling. "Yeah, Mia, I'm okay. I think things are gonna get better." Mia smiled, nodding. "Me too." They walked the rest of the way in silence, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the street. Peyton felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that, maybe, just maybe, they were finally moving forward. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face, but they weren't facing it alone. They had each other. And that was enough. Morning sunlight spilled across the front porch of Peyton's home, bright and warm, filling the air with a sense of new beginnings. Peyton stood by the window, looking out at the street. The neighborhood was buzzing with activity again, kids running around, people chatting as they worked on their houses. It was almost like things were back to normal. Almost. Denise came up behind him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about, Peyton?" she asked, her voice gentle. Peyton shrugged, glancing over his shoulder at her. "Just everything. How far we've come." Denise smiled, her eyes soft. "We have come a long way, haven't we? And we've got a lot to be proud of." Peyton nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. He looked over at Mia, who was sitting on the floor, playing with her stuffed bear. She looked so happy, her laughter filling the room, a sound that Peyton had missed more than he realized. Denise squeezed his shoulder lightly. "I think you deserve a break, Peyton. Why don't you go meet up with your friends? I saw a few of them playing down the street." Peyton turned to look at her, his eyes widening slightly. "You mean it?" She nodded, her smile growing. "You've done enough for us, Peyton. Go have some fun. You've earned it." Peyton hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Mom. But I'll be back soon, okay?" Denise waved him off, her eyes twinkling. "Go on, Peyton. We'll be just fine here." Peyton smiled, grabbing his shoes and heading out the door. The air was warm, the sun bright, and he could hear the sounds of kids laughing and shouting. He walked down the street, his heart feeling light for the first time in what felt like forever. He found his friends a few blocks down, gathered in an open lot. They were kicking around a soccer ball, their laughter echoing off the nearby houses. As soon as they saw him, one of them, Marcus waved him over. "Hey, Peyton, get over here," Marcus shouted, a wide grin on his face. Peyton jogged over, his heart pounding with excitement. It had been so long since he'd just played, without worrying about anything else. Marcus tossed him the ball, and Peyton caught it, dribbling it with his feet. "Think you still got it, Peyton?" Marcus teased, his eyes twinkling. Peyton smirked. Only one way to find out. He kicked the ball, sending it flying towards the makeshift goal they had set up, a couple of old crates stacked up at each end of the lot. Marcus ran after it, but Peyton was faster, his legs pumping as he moved across the field. The wind rushed past his face, and for a moment, he forgot everything. The flood, the fear, the exhaustion. All that mattered was the game, the laughter of his friends, the ball at his feet. He shot the ball towards the goal, his breath catching as it sailed through the air. It hit the back of the goal, and his friends erupted in cheers, their voices loud and joyous. Peyton laughed, his heart swelling with pride. "Still got it," Marcus shouted, clapping Peyton on the back. "You haven't lost your touch, man." Peyton grinned, catching his breath. "I guess not." They played for what felt like hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Peyton's legs ached, but he didn't care. He hadn't felt this free in so long, and he wasn't ready to let it go. Eventually, they all collapsed onto the grass, panting and sweating, but smiling from ear to ear. Peyton looked up at the sky, his eyes squinting against the bright blue. It was a perfect day, one that he knew he'd remember for a long time. "Hey, Peyton," Marcus said, his voice breaking the silence. "I heard about what you did for Mr. George. That was really brave, man." Peyton glanced over at Marcus, shrugging slightly. "I just did what I had to do. Anyone would have done the same." Marcus shook his head. "Nah, not everyone would have. But you did. You're a hero, you know that?" Peyton felt his face flush, and he looked away, embarrassed. "I'm not a hero, Marcus. I just wanted to help." "Well, you did," Marcus said, his voice sincere. "You helped a lot of people, and we're all proud of you." Peyton swallowed, his throat tight. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He looked around at his friends, their faces filled with admiration, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing the right thing, about taking care of the people around you. And if that made him a hero in their eyes, then maybe that was okay. After a while, Peyton got up, dusting the grass off his pants. "I should probably get home. My mom's gonna wonder where I am." Marcus nodded, standing up and giving Peyton a quick hug. "Take care, Peyton. And don't be a stranger, all right?" Peyton smiled, nodding. "I won't. See you guys later." He turned and headed back towards home, his heart feeling full. As he walked, he looked around at the neighborhood, the people working, the laughter, the sense of hope that had started to bloom. It was different now, but it was a good kind of different. They were rebuilding, together. When Peyton got home, Denise and Mia were in the front yard, working on cleaning up the last of the debris. Mia looked up, her face lighting up when she saw Peyton. "Peyton, you're back," she shouted, running over and wrapping her arms around his waist. Peyton laughed, ruffling her hair. "I told you I'd be back, didn't I?" Denise walked over, smiling at Peyton. "Did you have fun?" she asked. Peyton nodded. "Yeah, it was good to see everyone. Felt like things are getting back to normal." Denise nodded, her eyes soft. "We're getting there, one step at a time." They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, cleaning up the yard, making small repairs to the house. As the sun began to set, they sat on the front steps, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "Hey, Peyton," Denise said, her voice quiet. "I just want you to know how proud I am of you, for everything you've done, for our family, for Mr. George, for the neighborhood. You've grown up so much." Peyton looked at her, his eyes stinging. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." Denise smiled, wrapping her arm around Peyton's shoulders, pulling him close. Mia leaned against his side, her small hand holding onto his. They sat there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the air cooling as night fell. Peyton took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. They'd made it through the storm, together, and whatever came next, he knew they'd face it the same way. "Peyton," Mia said softly, her eyes closing as she rested her head against his shoulder. "Are we gonna be okay?" Peyton looked down at her, his heart swelling. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Yeah, Mia. We're gonna be okay. We're always gonna be okay." And as the night fell, Peyton knew that was true. They had each other. They had their home, their community, and their hope. And as long as they had that, they could face whatever came next.